In the Indian Ocean lies the infamous North Sentinel Island. You may have heard of it. The indigenous people living there are fiercely isolated, untouched by civilization. They actively drive away and sometimes kill anyone who approaches their beach. They have absolutely no contact with the outside world, and they've certainly never heard of Christianity. Now, for the atheist, it doesn't matter where you were born. There is no God to punish you for lack of belief. But for the Christian, if God requires explicit belief in Jesus to be saved, then everyone on that island is going straight to hell. And if this was all set up by a loving God, then this looks like a cruel, rigged game. But what if God actually judges these islanders on a different metric? This is a solid objection. It is important to remember what position it's objecting to. Spoiler alert, it's actually not my position. Well, not anymore. There are about 4 or 5 Christian views here worth considering, and I'm going to try to touch upon each one throughout the length of this video. The idea that unevangelized peoples or unreached peoples are lost and going to hell is a very strict, rigid understanding that's very popular in some Protestant circles, most specifically in some Baptist circles and some strict evangelical circles. We can call this framework strict exclusivism. It relies upon a specific reading from the Apostle Paul in Romans 1, arguing that general revelation, evidence for God found in nature and human conscience, is enough to leave people without excuse when they reject God. What's central and often missed in this framework is that it relies pretty heavily on explicit cognitive assent to certain propositions and certain truths. And that specific cognitive assent is what triggers grace, like, inviting Jesus into your heart and believe and you'll be saved. This is sometimes described as decisionism, where there's a moment of conversion, often at the altar call, where you pray the sinner's prayer, and then that leads to accepting Jesus into your heart, and then you become a born-again believer. This should all sound very familiar to you. And if you happen to live on an island in the Pacific and you've never heard the gospel, your lack of knowing doesn't mitigate your guilt, and, well, you know where you go. This also, by the way, explains why Baptists and evangelicals place such an emphasis on not just mission trips, but short-term mission trips, because after all it takes is just a moment of conversion. I know what this is like. I've been on a few. I mean, you're in and out like SEAL Team 6. There's not really much of an emphasis on building sustained relationships or changing communities. Speaking of short-term mission trips, don't remind me of the tragic case of John Allen Chow, who, driven by his conservative evangelical beliefs, tried making contact with the Sentinelese and was tragically killed by them. Obviously, a skeptic or atheist has serious reservations about this theological framework. It seems incredibly unfair for God to condemn someone to hell for not saying a few words or for just not having the right beliefs, especially when they had no possibility of ever doing so. And if you reject this framework, well, welcome to the club. I do too. Speaking of welcome to the club, if you like these deep dives, don't forget to subscribe, because we're just getting started in building this community. Skeptics' reservations are completely justified, but they only land if you hold a specific kind of Protestant view, which I don't hold. Okay, well, what view do I hold? As you may have seen in my channel description, I'm Catholic. And the Catholic Church offers a defined theological category known as Invincible Ignorance. Allow me to explain. While the Catholic Church, established by Jesus Christ, is the ordinary means of grace and the historical vessel for the gospel, the Church has long maintained that this is not the only way that God can extend his grace. God does not limit his salvific grace explicitly to these ordinary means. I mean, after all, he's God. There are also what are called extraordinary means of grace. Not that they're super cool, although they are. They're extraordinary in the sense that they're outside the ordinary. In the doctrine of invincible ignorance, those who, through no fault of their own, never encounter the Christian message, yet sincerely seek the truth of God and attempt to follow the dictates of their conscience, are still capable of receiving salvation from God. God holds human beings accountable for the specific light that they've received. They're not held morally responsible for failing to follow a law or to know a truth that they never could have followed or known. Note that invincible ignorance has long been affirmed since Augustine in the 4th and 5th century, an origin in the 3rd century, and perhaps even by earlier church fathers. That being said, it's still true that extra ecclesiam nulla salus, meaning there is no salvation outside the Catholic Church. In other words, the efficient cause of their salvation is not their own merits, but Christ's sacrifice. Well, why outside the church? Well, because Christ established the church and established the graces in those sacraments. So they're not earning their way to heaven. Christ's sacrifice still applies to them. Now, understanding this nuance helps us to avoid sliding into another Protestant trap, that of mainline Protestants that affirm pluralism or inclusivism, the idea that all religions are equally valid and everyone's just fine. No, the isolated tribesman isn't saved by his indigenous religion, nor is he saved by being merely a good person. He's saved by Christ's sacrifice. Now, interestingly, Catholics aren't alone in this framework. There are other Christian traditions that name it and conceptualize it differently, but are very similar in their practical workings out of it. For example, Eastern Orthodox talk about a mystery of hope. And Seventh-day Adventists talk about the light received, and Quakers discuss an inner light, and so on. Now, to be fair, Eastern Orthodox, with their mystery of hope, do sound a bit like broader evangelicals, not to be confused with the strict evangelicals we started out with this video. They both sound similar in this one small regard. They both discuss a hope for God's mercy. Orthodox, as we saw, call this a mystery of hope, whereas broader evangelicals hold a view that might be called restrictivism or positive agnosticism. On both of these views, they adopt a kind of hopeful silence about the fate of the unevangelized, and they rely upon God's character in hoping for mercy. But the big difference is their starting points. Broad evangelicals start from the starting point of kind of all are lost and they're just hoping for a rare exception. Whereas Orthodox start from a starting point of God is a lover of mankind and the boundaries of salvation are an unfathomable mystery. The Catholic position, as we saw, on the other hand, is a defined theological category. There are truly people who are truly innocent in their ignorance. This actually changes the nature of evangelization as well. Evangelicals evangelize in order to save people from certain damnation, whereas Catholics evangelize in order to offer the fullness of truth. But hold up, there seems to be a massive loophole here. If ignorance can save people, then why not just keep everyone in the dark? Why tell them anything? This is a very clever and frankly brilliant objection. If telling the tribesman puts his soul in danger of rejecting the truth, then why evangelize at all? I mean, let's just pack up the missions trip and leave them in their safe, ignorant bubble. Well, I have two things to say to this. First of all, this would only apply to truly unreached peoples, like the Sentinelese. It wouldn't apply to the vast majority of people in the world, and especially the vast majority of people in the West. Invincible means through no fault of their own. The moment you discover the truth and try to run away from it on a legal technicality, ignorance is no longer ignorance. It becomes culpable. It becomes vincible. You might say, well, that's the problem. Don't tell the Sentinelese about God, and then they'll be saved. But this leads to my second point. Treating ignorance as a safety net fundamentally misunderstands the human condition. Navigating the human experience relying solely on invincible ignorance is akin to trying to navigate a brutal wilderness at night, relying only upon the light of a single fading match. Yes, it's technically possible that you could stumble your way home, but it's incredibly dangerous, terrifying, and entirely deprived of warmth. Evangelization is not about handing out a divine pop quiz that you might fail. It's about turning on the floodlights. Sharing the truth brings objective healing in the sacraments. It brings clarity to a darkened intellect. It brings human beings into conscious, aware, and active loving communion with God that they are literally wired for and truly long for. And in doing so, this brings them into their full human flourishing. Okay, so the geographic lottery is a myth. God doesn't condemn people for lacking information they couldn't possibly have. God instead judges people based on the light they're actually given. Wait, does this actually apply to people who know about Christ but reject him anyway? Yes and no. The Catechism of the Catholic Church addresses this exact boundary in paragraph 846. Hence, they could not be saved who, knowing that the Catholic Church was founded as necessary by God through Christ, would refuse either to enter it or to remain in it. The entire framework hinges on culpability or blameworthiness. However, there's an important psychological caveat about what it means to actually know about Christ. If someone walks away from Christianity because it was presented to them in an abusive, corrupted, or entirely incoherent manner, then Catholic moral theology recognizes that they are not rejecting the actual person of Christ, they're rejecting a broken caricature. In those highly specific cases, their refusal might lack full culpability or blameworthiness because their intellect never genuinely encountered the true gospel. But this brings us back to the core problem of divine hiddenness. If God truly desires a full, flourishing relationship with us, and he's not trying to catch us in a geographic trap, then why doesn't he just show up in the sky right now and prove it to everyone? I actually made an entire video breaking down exactly this question. You can watch it right here. Until then, I'll see you next time. Take care.